Let's take our Bibles and go to Esther chapter 2. It is Wednesday night. It is prayer night. We are going to gather together in prayer, corporate prayer as a church for our spiritual needs, our physical needs. But before we do, we always want to study God's Word, allow God's Word to affect our hearts as we come to His presence. So chapter 2 of Esther, we're working our way through this book, a shorter book compared to other books we've been in, but it's a powerful book, an amazing book. Now let's just do some review. Last week we were in chapter 1, and we were introduced to two characters, a main character and kind of a side character in the story. Like, her importance really only was in so much that she was removed from the story, and that was who? Anybody remember? What was the queen's name? Vashti. 2 weeks ago. We had a missionary last week. 2 weeks ago. So 2 weeks ago in chapter 1 we had Vashti. Vashti is the queen of the Persian Empire. And we are introduced to the king. Does anybody remember? I think two different names that history knows him by. I'll take either one. The king of Persia in the story of Esther. His name was... Go ahead, Dave. Ahasuerus, right. Or we know him also by his Greek name, Xerxes. How many have ever heard of Xerxes? The Spartan 300 against the army. Anyway, but Xerxes, Leonidas versus Xerxes, yeah. Xerxes, or Ahasuerus as he's known in the story here. Ahasuerus throws a party. A big party. It is so big that he had to throw another party just to cap off the first party, right? And the first party lasted, I believe, 180 days, celebrating with his princes and his chief rulers. And then they had a week-long party with all the people in Shushan. All the people in the city gathered together in the palace, and they celebrated the king's might and glory. And the king wanted to show off the beauty of Queen Vashti. So he called for Vashti, and Vashti said, if we could put it in our more modern language, right? She said, no way. And we don't know why. We do not know the circumstances. I gave some traditions according to history. But as far as the Bible is concerned, the reason why she said no doesn't matter. All that matters for the story here is that she said no. And because she said no, it got King Ahasuerus and his princes riled up. And so they said, well, we got to do something, because now none of our wives are going to obey us. So they cast Vashti out of the kingdom. And we come to chapter 2, verse 1. After these things, after Ahasuerus had done this, when the wrath of King Ahasuerus was appeased, he remembered Vashti and what she had done and what was decreed against her. So he got some time to cool off. And then said the king's servants that ministered unto him, let there be fair young virgins sought for the king. King needs a new queen. So let's begin the hiring process. And let the king appoint officers in all provinces in his kingdom, that they may gather together all the fair young virgins into Shushan the palace, to the house of the women, under the custody of Haggai the king's chamberlain, keeper of the women, and let their things for purification be given them. And let the maiden which pleaseth the king be queen instead of Vashti. And the thing pleased the king, and he did so. Now, in Shushan the palace, there was a certain Jew, whose name was, and let's read it together, Mordecai. Now we have another character here. He's important, Mordecai. Mordecai is the son of Jair, the son of Shimei, the son of Kish, a Benjamite. So what tribe is Mordecai from? He's from the tribe of Benjamin. Let's keep reading. Who had been carried away from Jerusalem with the captivity which had been carried away with Jeconiah, king of Judah, whom Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, had carried away. Now pause for a moment. It has been quite some time since we were in the book of Jeremiah. But if you were to go to the book of 2 Kings or 2 Chronicles, you might struggle to find the name Jeconiah. So let me refresh your memory. Jeconiah is another name for King Jehoiachin. Jehoiakim was Josiah's son. His son Jehoiakim, so Jehoiakim with M, and Jehoiakim, or Chin, with the N there. He ruled after his father until he ticked Nebuchadnezzar off, and that was the end of his reign there. Nebuchadnezzar carried him away captive. Now, it says who had been carried away captive. It's not talking about Mordecai. Mordecai was not carried away captive with Jeconiah, king of Judah. His great-great-grandfather had. So, because if Mordecai had been part of that bunch, he would have been over 100 years old. Okay, so just it's a little thing that you can miss. I want to be there. Let's keep reading. And he had brought up, and what's this person's name? Hadassah. That is, what's her other name? Esther. So we have two names given for Esther. Hadassah is her Jewish name. It means myrtle. Esther is her Persian name, and it means star. Is just the reference there. He brought up Hadassah, that is Esther, his uncle's daughter, for she had neither father nor mother. And the maid was fair and beautiful, whom Mordecai, when her father and mother were dead, took for his own daughter. So it came to pass, when the king's commandment and his decree was heard, and when many maidens were gathered together into Shushan the palace, to the custody of Haggai, that Esther was brought also into the king's house, to the custody of Haggai, keeper of the women. And the maiden pleased him, and she obtained kindness of him, and he speedily gave her things for purification, which such things as belonged to her, and 7 maidens which were meet to be given her out of the king's house, and he preferred her and her maids unto the best place of the house of the women. And Esther had not showed her people nor her kindred, for Mordecai had charged her that she should not show it. And Mordecai walked every day before the court of the women's house, to know how Esther did and what should become of her. Now, when every maid's turn was come to go in to King Ahasuerus, after that she had been 12 months, according to the manner of women, for so were the days of purification accomplished, to wit, 6 months with oil and myrrh, and 6 months with sweet odors, and with other things for the purification of the women. Then thus came every maiden unto the king. Whatsoever she desired was given her to go with her out of the house of the women into the king's house. In the evening she went in, and on the morrow she returned into the second house of the women, to the custody of Shashgaz, the king's chamberlain, which kept the concubines. She came in unto the king no more, except the king delighted in her, and she was called by name. Now, when the turn of Esther, the daughter of Abihail, the uncle of Mordecai, who had taken her for his daughter, was come to go in unto the king, she required nothing but what Haggai, the king's chamberlain, and the keeper of the women appointed. And Esther obtained favor in the sight of all them that looked upon her. So Esther was taken unto King Ahasuerus into his royal house in the 12th month, which is the month Tebeth, in the 7th year of his reign. And the king loved Esther above all the women, and she obtained grace and favor in his sight more than all the virgins, so that he set the royal crown upon her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. Then the king made a great feast unto all his princes and his servants, even Esther's feast, and he made a release to the provinces and gave gifts according to the state of the king. And when the virgins were gathered together the second time, then Mordecai sat in the king's gate. Esther had not yet showed her kindred, nor her people, as Mordecai had charged her. For Esther did the commandment of Mordecai, like as when she was brought up with him. So we have the story now, the next part of the story rather, and that is Esther becoming the queen. Esther stepping forward. I want to give a few things tonight. Number one, we see Esther's lineage. We're introduced to the family she is from. She is a Benjamite. Her adoptive father, her cousin, Mordecai, is from the tribe of Benjamin. Mordecai's uncle was Esther's father. We know this. There are some commentaries that believe with Esther, with Mordecai's great-grandfather being named Kish, that likely there was some connection to King Saul. So chances are these were descendants of King Saul, the royal kingdom there. Esther was an orphan. Her parents were dead. Her cousin, out of the kindness of his heart, took her in and raised her. This isn't necessarily the start of a great story. I mean, well, I guess it's the start of a great story, but not an easy life. And yet now we have this orphan lady, this orphan raised up by her cousin in a foreign land. She is a Jew with her cousin living in Persia. They are servants. They are slaves to the king of Persia. Then a decree comes from the king. All the young virgins, all the pretty maidens, bring them forward, bring them into the house of the king. They're going to be his concubines, and one lucky lady gets to be the queen. The Bible says she was taken. She didn't have a choice. Here's this orphan girl raised by her cousin. She is a slave in Persia. And now she is taken because of her beauty to be one of the king's concubines. That's where she came from. That's the introduction we get to this incredible woman we're going to see named Esther. And as we watch Esther's story, we see God's provision. Remember, with the story of Esther, in the book of Esther, God is not mentioned one time. It is the only book in the Bible where God's name is never mentioned. But where God is not mentioned, He has this uncanny ability of showing up. Where we think that God is not there, where we think that God is absent, where we think that God is taking His hand off the situation, He is always working in the background. And that's incredible to think of, especially in our day and age right now. I mean, it just seems like the wheels are coming off real quick. It is encouraging to know that no matter what we see in our culture, God is still working. God is still changing lives. God is still planting churches. God is still saving souls. God is still bringing disciples to follow Jesus and take the good news of the gospel throughout the whole world. God is still at work, especially in the background. And as we watch Esther, we saw her lineage, but let's talk about her provisions here. Talk about the hand of God in this lady's life. This young woman, according to the king's decree, she's taken to the house with all these other women. And there would have been hundreds. They were brought from every province, dragged from every place. There have been hundreds. Hundreds of options the king could have chosen from. Hundreds of women that Haggai, the head over the other women, could have picked. And yet God gave her favor in this man's life. This keeper of the women, and eventually the king. God gave her favor. He saw this Esther, and there's something about Esther, we don't know what, that just caused him to say, man, this lady, this woman, she's wonderful. I'm trying to think of a good way to describe her. She's amazing. My college president would say A++. I mean, she is A++. She's got, I don't believe it was just her looks. We learn she's very submissive, very humble. Man, she was pretty inside and out. Just being the lady that God made her to be. Think about that for a moment. I'm going to tie into that in a little bit. She wasn't putting out airs. She wasn't being pretentious. She wasn't in that situation thinking, well, I am going to work my way up to the top and I'm going to be the queen. No. She's just dealing with the hand that's been dealt her. She's an orphan. She's a slave. She's in this, whether she likes it or not, and she's going to make the best of it. And God provided. God gave her favor. She was taken to the king's house. God provided in a way that we'll see later, where Esther was given some wisdom from Mordecai to keep her lineage a secret. Throughout the rest of the story, she is never referred to as Hadassah. She's not called by her Jewish name. She's called by a Persian name. She is hiding, in a sense, who she is, and it's going to play out later in ways that I don't think Mordecai or Esther could have ever expected. God is providing. God is giving her favor. She's blessed beautifully. She's pretty inside and out. She is hiding her kindred for a moment. And so we see here not only Esther's lineage, Esther's provision, God's taking care of her, God's with her, but then Esther's favor, the ultimate favor. She comes that night before the king. Now we have to kind of understand the process here. According to the Persian court here, as these women were being selected for the queen, they went through an incredible makeover, a year-long makeover. For 6 months, they are treated with one beauty treatment, say with myrrh. We don't know exactly. You can probably study history to learn that, but I didn't dive into that. But for 6 months, they're treated with myrrh. For 6 months, they're treated with other spices, other fragrances. It's a year-long beauty treatment to make them as pretty as they possibly can be, to send them before the king for one night. And one night, the king's going to do what he will with them and decide, queen or not. Off to the second house, off to the concubine house. And many of those women, hundreds, hundreds probably there, the majority of them will never see the king's face again. So this is a big moment. High stakes. Because they'll basically live, they can't marry anybody else. They're going to live as a servant to the king for the rest of their lives. But there's still something about Esther. She comes to her night with the king, and she is prepared. And the Bible tells us that these women, they could take whatever they wanted from the house of women, and they could take any perfume or any attire, whatever they needed to do to give them the best chance of being approved by the king. And did you catch what it said about Esther? She only took what was required. She didn't need extra. She wasn't looking for position. She was just making do with where she was. Humble. Kind. This is Esther. We're going to see courageous in a little bit. This is Esther. And that catches the king's eyes. She's not coming in portraying something she's not. There's just something about Esther that causes the king to say, hey, you know what? This is the one. She is better than any other woman I have met. She is far better than Vashti. She is far better than anybody else, any of the other ladies waiting. No, this is the one. Let's get the crown. Let's put it on her head. Let's celebrate. Let's send out gifts. Let's make a big to-do, because this is the one. So we see the story here. God is bringing this lady into a position of power. She is a Jewish girl, now the queen of the Persian Empire. And I want to give an application tonight. I think it's a pretty simple one here. We need to read just 3 more verses before I do. Notice verse 21. In those days, while Mordecai sat in the king's gate, 2 of the king's chamberlains, Bigthan and Teresh, of those which kept the door, were wroth, and sought to lay hands on the king Ahasuerus. For whatever reason, they were upset at the king, and they were ready to take him out. And the thing was known to Mordecai. Mordecai overheard it. He wasn't going out of his way. He just was in the right place at the right time. The thing was known to Mordecai, who told it unto Esther the queen, and Esther certified the king thereof in Mordecai's name. And when inquisition was made of the matter, it was found out. Therefore they were both hanged on a tree, as is written in the book of the Chronicles before the king. So Esther, she's just being Esther. And she becomes the queen. Mordecai, he's just doing his job. We know from reading the rest of the chapter, he sat at the gate of the king. He's just where he's supposed to be. And because he is where he's supposed to be, he heard this, or overheard this plot to destroy the king. And here's the application of the story, or of this chapter I want us to take away with here. We're going to see that God is going to do great things with Mordecai and Esther. God is going to accomplish an amazing victory over the pride and arrogance of man, and by proxy, the working of Satan. But neither of these two individuals were going out of their way to do something great. Mordecai was just doing his job. Esther was being Esther. She's just sitting and pretty. I mean, that's it. Being who God made them to be and doing what God made them to do. That's encouraging for us. It really ought to be. Because we study the Bible, we look at these stories of men and women gone by, these heroes of the faith, and we think, man, if only I could do something great like they do. But I'm no Elijah. I couldn't call down fire from heaven and overcome the prophets of Baal. I'm not Moses. I couldn't part the Red Sea. I'm not Peter. I can't preach to 5,000 people and see them all come to Christ, or rather 3,000 people and see them all come to Christ. That's not me. Hold up. God doesn't need you to be Moses. He had a Moses. Moses did what he was supposed to do. He's come, he's gone. God doesn't need you to be Elijah. God doesn't need you to be Peter. God needs you to be you. And simply do what you were made to do. Be where you're supposed to be and be who you're supposed to be. A simple truth. But it's one we forget so often. Sometimes we think, well, if I could maybe put feet of clay for a moment here. As a pastor, sometimes I see other pastors like, man, if only I could talk like he does. If only I could preach like he does. I mean, he has always the right words to say, and he's so smart, and it just seems like their ministry is going well. If I could just be like that person, just feet of clay for a moment. I know it's not wise, and you can say what you will. I know it isn't. I'm just saying, this is who I am. This is what I struggle with sometimes. If I could just be someone else. God doesn't need me to be someone else. God needs me to be Andrew. God made me to be Andrew. God called me to be the pastor of this church, not another church. I'm to pastor this church and work with all my might, doing what I'm supposed to do here on a day-by-day basis. That's it. That's what God made me to do. That's what God called me to do. That's where He put me. And the same for you. So what I want you to do is I want you to stop and think, what did God make me to do? You say, well, I don't have the personality like so-and-so does. God didn't need you to have that personality. You've got the personality you've got. He put you in the home He put you in, under the circumstances you were in, that developed you to be the person you are today, and He intends to use you as you are. He fills in the details. He makes you become who He wants you to be if He needs you to change. Just give Him what you got. Just do what you're supposed to do. And I don't know who needs to hear this. I don't know, maybe it's somebody on the live stream or on the YouTube that's really struggling with this. Just be who God made you to be. And give Him what you have to give Him. Don't be looking for greatness. Don't go out and try to make much of yourself. That's pride. I'm going to be somebody. Just say, hey, God, here I am. Use me how you want to use me. Have drive, have confidence, do those things. Those are healthy. But don't be so eaten up that you have to have prominence and you have to have position and you have to be important. Just, you know who God says is important in the kingdom of heaven? The least. That's who. So just simple truth, simple challenge, something to remind us of as we consider the story of Queen Esther. Listen.